Okay, yeah, I know I've done episodes on snakes before. In episode 27, I talked about snakes with medically significant venom, and in episode 46, I talked about snakes that are commonly found in Virginia, which was at the time the location of Dispatch's world headquarters. But Dispatch's world headquarters is now in Wyoming, where we have some of those same snakes, but some different ones too. But I'll tell you what really remains the same, and that's a lot of people's fear and misunderstanding of snakes. And one of the best ways to combat fear and misunderstanding is education. Learn about the snakes that live in your area. Knowing how to identify your local snakes, including the ones that may be medically significant, can help alleviate some of that fear and anxiety, especially since "is it venomous" is usually the first question asked by anyone who sees a snake of any kind. Plus, snakes are pretty cool, and who knows, you might just learn something interesting along the way. So with that in mind, let's take a closer look at some of my new hysterical neighbors. I'm your host, Tim the Nature Nerd O'Hara, and this is the Dispatches from the Forest podcast. So, I have a confession to make. I have a bad habit of providing impromptu nature education on social media. I know it's a bad idea, my wife tells me all the time, but sometimes I just can't help myself, especially when it comes to misinformation and fear-mongering when it comes to nature. So here's how it went down. Here at F.E. Warren Air Force Base, we have a species of ground squirrel called Wyoming ground squirrels. They're smaller than a prairie dog, about the size of your average tree squirrel, and they're plentiful. So someone posted in a Facebook group asking for advice for getting these ground squirrels to stay out of their yard. And in the responses, another person wrote, quote, "Remember, rattlesnakes take over prairie dog homes, so where there's vermin, there will be snakes," unquote. Now, to be fair, I pondered that comment for a good couple of hours before I responded. You see, comments like this make me just a little bit crazy. First of all, it really has nothing to do with the person's question about keeping the ground squirrels out of their backyard. There was no advice for hazing, trapping, or otherwise encouraging the ground squirrels to find a better place to live. And not even any advice, good or bad, for deterring snakes. Secondly, a comment like that just seems specifically designed to make the reader scared of snakes. Where they were just trying to get rid of the ground squirrels, now they're equating ground squirrels with a medically significant species of snake. So the ground squirrel, or at least their burrow by extension, now represents a serious danger to the reader, their kids, and the family dog. And finally, because that threat is, at the very least, exaggerated. So here in Wyoming, we have two medically significant venomous species of snake, both of them rattlesnakes. One, the Midget faded rattlesnake, which I'll talk about a little later, lives in southwest Wyoming, nowhere close to here. The second, which can be found here, is the Prairie Rattlesnake. Now, while it's true that prairie rattlesnakes will take over abandoned ground squirrel or prairie dog burrows, and they may eat the young ground squirrels or prairie dogs, fully grown ground squirrels and prairie dogs are generally too big for them to prey on. But more importantly, prairie rattlesnakes prefer to live in rocky areas with dense vegetation that keeps them hidden from predators like hawks and eagles, while also helping them to ambush their own prey. The short grass lawns found in the housing areas here on base don't fit that description. Sure, there may be rattlesnake prey there, but it's not their preferred habitat, and there are plenty of areas nearby that have both prey and cover. In fact, to that point, and mind you, this is purely speculation, the large number of ground squirrels thriving in the housing areas is probably partially due to a lack of predators like coyotes, foxes, raptors, and, yes, snakes that would otherwise keep their numbers in check. I'm not saying that a rattlesnake won't show up in these housing areas, but I am saying that it seems unlikely, and I don't know that it's ever happened in the past. But let's talk a little bit more about prairie rattlers. Prairie rattlesnakes have a wide geographic distribution, ranging from southern Canada to Mexico. In the United States, they can be found through much of the Great Plains and eastern foothills of the Rocky Mountains, up to about 9,000 feet or 2,700 meters in elevation, in Montana, Wyoming, North and South Dakota, Nebraska, Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas, and New Mexico. Prairie rattlesnakes average 3.5 to 4 feet long. They're generally light shades of brown with a pattern of dark brown patches on their backs. And, of course, prairie rattlesnakes will usually have a rattle at the end of their tail. The number of segments in the rattle increases each time they shed their skin, so the number of segments can give you a rough estimate of the snake's age. They also have the typical triangular-shaped head people usually associate with venomous species of snake. But, that said, a triangular-shaped head is not necessarily a good indication of whether or not a particular snake is venomous. Many non-venomous snakes will flatten out their head when threatened to mimic venomous species, and there are venomous snakes that don't have a triangular head. Prairie rattlesnakes feed primarily on small mammals, and less frequently on birds, eggs, amphibians, and even other snakes, all of which they hunt using a combination of ambush and patience. Typically, the snake will wait in a concealed location, like a rock crevice or a grassy area. The color and pattern of the snake is excellent camouflage, and it blends almost seamlessly with its environment, making it nearly invisible. When suitable prey comes within striking distance, the snake strikes with remarkable speed, lunging a few feet in a fraction of a second, injecting the prey with its venom. The venom of the prairie rattlesnake has both hemotoxic and neurotoxic properties. Kind of on a side note, hemotoxic venoms work by destroying tissue and disrupting blood clotting. Neurotoxic venoms work on the nervous system, causing paralysis. Snakes that eat more mammalian prey tend to have hemotoxic venoms. Snakes that eat more lizards and amphibians tend to have neurotoxic venoms. Like all rattlesnakes, prairie rattlesnakes can control the amount of venom they release in each bite, and they usually use 20 to 50% of their venom per bite when hunting. When used defensively, it might use even less or even none at all, and that's what's called a dry bite. You see, producing venom is expensive, metabolically speaking. It takes a lot of energy, so they don't want to waste it defensively if they don't have to. The venom quickly immobilizes the prey so the snake can have a leisurely meal. After swallowing its prey, a prairie rattlesnake can go for several weeks or even months without needing to eat again. This ability to go long periods between meals is an adaptation that helps these snakes survive in what can be a harsh and unpredictable environment. In between meals, the snake conserves energy and does everything possible to go undetected by potential predators. Again, a good reason for it to avoid areas where there's a lot of people, dogs, and kids. Prairie rattlesnakes are viviparous, meaning they give birth to live young. In the springtime, males actively search for females and engage in courtship rituals. After mating, the female carries the eggs inside her body until late summer or early fall when she gives birth to anywhere from 8 to 17 live young. These babies are fully formed and independent as soon as they're born, although the mother will stay with them for several days after birth. Now, I mentioned in episode 27 that there is a myth that baby snakes are more dangerous because they can't control how much venom they release in each bite, but that's not true. Like I said, it's a myth. They can control their venom release as soon as they hatch. Now, the midget faded rattlesnake is only found in a relatively small area that encompasses parts of southwestern Wyoming, a little piece of Utah, and a bit of extreme west central Colorado. This area is a high, cold desert characterized by sagebrush with an abundance of rocky outcrops and exposed canyon walls. Midget faded rattlesnakes are a subspecies of the western rattlesnake and average about 2 feet long, maxing out at about 2.5 feet long. Juvenile snakes have a distinct pattern which fades in adults, almost to the point where the snake is nearly indistinguishable from the color of the ground, usually a reddish brown. Rock outcrops serve as focal points for these snakes, providing protection from predators, thermal regulation, and places to brumate, the technical term for reptile hibernation. These outcrops are especially important given the short warm season and long cold winters in the snake's range. Faded rattlesnakes often den in groups, sometimes numbering up to 100 individuals. Here in Wyoming, they reach their northern limit, and the distribution of suitable denning outcrops is a key factor in determining where that limit is. Now, after emerging from brumation in April and May, the snakes stay near the den entrance for the next 2 to 3 weeks before moving to what's called shedding habitats, which are large flat rocks that help them molt. Gravid females, those that are carrying eggs, typically move less than 65 feet from their brumation den after emerging. Males and non-gravid females, on the other hand, have some of the longest migrations and largest activity ranges reported for any species of rattlesnake. They might go as far as 1.5 miles from their denning site. The snakes have separate winter, spring, and summer activity ranges and make shorter, more random movements during the summer, primarily associated with hunting. A study in 2007 identified 25 different prey species consumed by faded rattlesnakes, including 16 species of lizard, 6 small mammals, and 3 birds. Accordingly, the venom of the faded rattlesnake is neurotoxic, and it's the most toxic venom of all the pit vipers. In fact, it's one of the most potent venoms in North America, 5 to 30 times more potent than the venom of other western rattlesnake species. It's even many times more potent than that of the Asiatic cobra. That said, there's still no reason to fear this snake. Bites on humans are rare thanks to the snake's remote habitat and relatively mild disposition. Now, while pondering my response to the original social media post, I was out riding my bike and I came across a large dead snake on the side of the road. But this wasn't a prairie rattlesnake, it was a bull snake. Bull snakes are a subspecies of gopher snake, and they're often mistaken for prairie rattlesnakes because in size, color, and pattern, they look very similar. And, as I'll talk about in a minute, when bull snakes are put on defense, they can put on a good show and act a lot like prairie rattlesnakes too. But bull snakes are not venomous, they're a constrictor. They are, however, one of the largest snakes native to the United States and Canada, averaging 4 to 6 feet long, with individuals recorded at over 8 feet long. They range throughout the Great Plains and Midwestern United States and from southern Canada to northern Mexico. Bull snakes eat small mammals like mice, moles, rats, pocket gophers, and ground squirrels because they're bigger than prairie rattlesnakes. They'll also eat lizards, ground nesting birds and their eggs, and they're excellent climbers like the eastern rat snake and can easily raid the nests of tree nesting birds and birdhouses to eat the nestlings or the sitting mother. A single snake can consume 5 small birds in less than 15 minutes. Juvenile bull snakes depend primarily on small lizards, frogs, and baby mice. Now, some people think that bull snakes also eat rattlesnakes, but a study of 1,000 bull snakes found only 2 with rattlesnake in their stomach contents. So while it can happen, it seems to be an extremely rare occurrence. But I would say for the people living in housing here on base, these snakes are probably more likely to help with the ground squirrel problem, and even though it was dead, I've now seen 100% more bull snakes on this base than I have prairie rattlesnakes. Bull snakes breed in early spring, and unlike rattlesnakes, they're oviparous. They lay eggs. Eggs, usually about a dozen, are laid in the late spring in sand or another protected area and left to incubate on their own. They hatch in the late summer. But it's their acting ability that makes these snakes really interesting. When bull snakes sense an animal that's too big to be prey, they think maybe it's a predator and they take defensive action. Their first line of defense is to stay still and quiet. When they feel they can move away safely, their next line of defense is to get the heck out of Dodge as quickly as possible. But bull snakes are not super fast, and so they may feel the need to take other defensive actions. When threatened by something as large as, say, a human, and feeling like escape is not an option, a bull snake's next defensive action is to rear up and make itself look as large as possible, while at the same time hissing at the perceived threat. It typically then begins lunging and retreating at the same time. Now, like I said, bull snakes look very similar to prairie rattlesnakes, making it easy for people to mistake the two. And the bull snake capitalizes on this similarity by performing an impressive rattlesnake impression when threatened. First, it hisses, forcing air out through its windpipe, which is covered by a flap of cartilage. This cartilage flaps back and forth when air is exhaled, making a sound very similar to a rattlesnake's rattle. It will also adopt a rattlesnake-like S-curve body posture like it's about to strike. It'll flatten out its head to enhance the illusion and vibrate its tail in dead leaves. One way to differentiate between a bull snake and a rattlesnake, though, is that rattlesnakes elevate the rattles on their tails, but bull snakes and other snakes that mimic rattlesnakes in this way will keep their tails on the ground. Interestingly, a study on gopher snakes found that gopher snakes on islands that don't have rattlesnakes vibrate their tails for shorter amounts of time than gopher snakes in, say, mainland California, which is home to several rattlesnake species. This reinforces the idea that this tail vibration is in fact rattlesnake mimicry, since the behavior seems to be fading out in areas without rattlesnakes, probably because predators on these islands have no reason to learn to avoid tail vibrating snakes. All that tail shaking doesn't mean anything to them. If a bull snake does strike, it usually strikes with a closed mouth, which is an image that always makes me smile. A snake banging its face on you trying to look scary and make you go away. Now, there are a lot of other snake species in Wyoming, including several species of garter snakes, the hognose snake, and a couple species of racers, which are all snakes I talked about in episode 46. So if you want to learn more about those, go check out that episode. But before I wrap this episode up, I want to talk a little bit about one other snake. Not a Wyoming species, but an example of how misinformation about snakes, or anything else really, can be spread through carelessness. On the Virginia Wildlife Facebook page, a picture of a snake was posted asking for an ID. The snake was identified as an eastern mud snake, and a link to the Virginia Herpetological Society page with information about eastern mud snakes was posted. Now, I'm not going to go into the life history of the eastern mud snake, but for this story, what you need to know is that mud snakes do not have medically significant venom, and they have a pointed, hardened tail tip that they use for prodding prey into position for eating. Now, in the article that was linked to the identification, it talked about how this species of snake is thought to be the one that inspired the myth of the hoop snake. According to this myth, the snake will take its tail in its mouth and roll downhill chasing someone. When it reaches the bottom, it releases its tail and launches itself into the air, trying to embed the tail stinger, quote unquote, which, mind you, in reality is not a stinger at all, into the person. And, according to the myth, the wound is always fatal. Now, under the link to the information about the snake, someone posted the following comment, quote, "It says harmless, but implies its tail can sting you and that's fatal. I read it quickly, so maybe I misread it. Can anyone clarify?" Unquote. So, just to be clear, this person read the information, the same information that I read, but they didn't read it carefully, just skimmed and picked out the words sting and fatal. Then, instead of spending the time to read more carefully, they came back to the post and asked for someone else to read it for them. And this, my friends, is how rumors get started. Now, I guess it's good that they asked for clarification, but wouldn't it have been faster to just go back and read more carefully? I mean, it just feels lazy. Remember that snakes, any snake, really wants nothing to do with you. You're much too big for them to eat, and in their mind, you might want to eat them. And snakes are never aggressive towards humans, or dogs for that matter. They're defensive. If they strike at you, if they bite you, or otherwise act in a way that you would describe as aggressive, it's because they want you to back off. The reason rattlesnakes rattle, and the reason other snakes mimic that behavior, is as a warning to leave them alone. And the best thing you can do is listen. So let me just leave you with one last thing, and then I'll stop talking about snakes, at least for now. Now, I said this in episode 27 when I talked about medically significant venomous snakes, but it bears repeating. Every year in the United States, somewhere between 7,000 and 8,000 people are bitten by medically significant venomous snakes. But a whopping 57% of those bites happen to people handling the snake. And that percentage is likely higher because it relies on self-report. And I'm guessing that not everyone is totally honest about how they got bit. Even if it is accurate, it means that over half of venomous snake bites are entirely preventable. Those 7,000 to 8,000 bites result in about 5 deaths. So to put that in perspective, about the same number of people in the United States die each year from getting crushed by vending machines, and about 300 people in the US are struck by lightning. So you're literally 60 times more likely to get struck by lightning than to be killed by being bitten by a venomous snake. Okay, Wild Wanderers, thanks for listening and thanks for letting me vent. Leave a like and subscribe so you never miss an episode of this podcast or of the new Dirt Dispatches, my new short-form podcast. If you want to support the show, consider becoming a patron. You can find out how at patreon.com/dispatches from the forest. Subscriptions start at just $5 a month. You can also make a one-time donation via PayPal. dispatchesfromtheforest@gmail.com is my PayPal address, and that's also where you can contact me with questions, comments, or suggestions. Another thing you can do is get some Dispatches from the Forest merch. The merch store and all it has to offer can be found at cafepress.com/dispatches from the forest. I'm your host, Tim the Nature Nerd O'Hara, reminding you to go outside and get dirty. The Dispatches from the Forest podcast is a production of Dispatches from the Forest. It may not be used or rebroadcast, whole or in part, without express written permission. If you do, I'm going to get defensive.